A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
How do you measure something that only exists in the shadows? It's a question that sounds more like a riddle for a detective or a philosopher than a problem for a professional economist, but it's actually at the heart of how we understand global stability today. If you are trying to track inflation, you look at the price of bread and fuel. If you are trying to track unemployment, you count the people actively looking for work. But if you are trying to track corruption, you are essentially trying to weigh smoke. You're trying to quantify an activity that is, by its very definition, designed to leave no paper trail, happen behind closed doors, and involve people who have every incentive to lie about what they are doing.
It's the ultimate measurement paradox, corn. And it's something our housemate Daniel was asking about recently. He sent us a prompt wondering how these global corruption indices actually work. We see the headlines every year when the new rankings come out, usually with Denmark at the top and Somalia at the bottom. But how do you turn a series of secret handshakes, off-book bank transfers, and whispered promises into a clean numerical score out of 100? I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been diving deep into the methodology of the latest reports, specifically the 2025 Transparency International results that were released just 2 months ago to see if the math actually holds up to the reality on the ground.
From Daniel, because it forces us to look at the difference between what we know and what we think we know. When we talk about corruption, we're usually talking about the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. But that manifests in so many different ways. You have petty corruption, like a small bribe to a traffic cop to avoid a ticket. Then you have grand corruption at the highest levels of government, where billions of dollars are diverted from public infrastructure into private offshore accounts. And then there is the really dangerous stuff, what political scientists call systemic corruption or state capture, where the rules of the game themselves are written to benefit a small elite.
Spot on. And because you cannot just go around asking people to fill out a tax form for their illegal bribes, the international community has had to get creative. We have moved from the era of anecdotal reporting, where you just had brave journalists writing about individual scandals, to this highly standardized index-based governance. Today, a country's score on a corruption index can determine everything from how much foreign aid they receive to the interest rates they pay on their national debt. If your score drops 5 points, it can literally cost your taxpayers billions of dollars in increased borrowing costs. So the stakes of getting the measurement right are incredibly high.
Right, but that brings us back to the paradox. If the act itself is clandestine, what are we actually measuring? Are we measuring corruption, or are we just measuring the visibility of corruption? Because those are two very different things. A country with a free press and an aggressive judiciary might look more corrupt because every scandal is on the front page and every crooked official is being prosecuted. Meanwhile, a total dictatorship might look clean on the surface because anyone who talks about a bribe disappears and the media is strictly controlled.
That is the fundamental critique of the Corruption Perceptions Index, or the CPI. It is right there in the name, perceptions. It does not claim to measure the actual number of bribes paid or the total dollar amount of stolen funds. Instead, it aggregates data from at least 13 different data sources from 12 independent institutions. We are talking about the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, private risk consulting firms like Global Insight, and think tanks like the Bertelsmann Stiftung. They are surveying experts and business leaders, asking them, based on your experience doing business in this country, how much do you have to worry about graft?
So it is an index of indices. It is a meta-analysis of what the international elite thinks about a country's integrity, and we need to be honest about the trade-offs there. When you rely on expert opinion, you are getting a high-level view from people who understand the system, but you are also potentially catching a lot of bias. If a country is currently a media darling, or is moving in a political direction that international NGOs like, their perception score might improve, even if the actual level of graft has stayed the same. It is a feedback loop.
You are hitting on something we talked about back in episode 987 when we discussed reputation laundering. There are specialized firms out there whose entire job is to help controversial figures or regimes edit their history and improve their standing in these kinds of metrics. If you can influence the people who fill out the surveys for the World Economic Forum or the Economist Intelligence Unit, you can theoretically bump your CPI score without actually firing a single corrupt official. You are essentially hacking the perception rather than fixing the reality.
That is a huge point. And it leads to a statistical question I know you have looked into, Herman. How do these organizations handle the uncertainty? If they are aggregating 13 different sources, and one source says a country is a 10, and another says it is a 50, how do they reconcile that?
They use a pretty rigorous standardization process, converting every source to a scale of 0 to 100, but they also publish the standard error. For a lot of countries, that margin of error is actually quite wide. If you look at the 2025 data, you will see that for many developing nations, their rank could easily swing 10 or 15 places in either direction just based on the statistical noise. But the public and the markets rarely look at the standard error. They just see that country X moved from rank 80 to rank 85 and assume things are getting worse. It is a false precision that can have real-world consequences.
It is the measurement trap we discussed in episode 1346. We prioritize the dashboard over the reality. But let's look at the theoretical framework here. Why does corruption happen in the first place? In economics, we usually talk about the principal-agent problem. This is the foundational idea for understanding why a government official would betray the public trust.
You're right. Think of it like a homeowner and a contractor. The homeowner is the principal, the person who wants the job done. The contractor is the agent, the person hired to do the work. The problem is that the contractor knows more about the job than the homeowner does. This is information asymmetry. The contractor might want to cut corners or use cheaper materials to save money, and the homeowner might not have the expertise to notice.
Now apply that to a massive government bureaucracy. The citizens are the principal, and the government official is the agent. The official has the power to grant a permit, award a multi-million-dollar contract, or overlook a regulatory violation. The citizens cannot possibly monitor every single decision that official makes. So, if the official sees an opportunity to take a kickback and the risk of getting caught is low, the incentive structure is skewed. Corruption is basically the agent serving themselves instead of the principal.
And that is why the most effective anti-corruption strategies are not just about moral crusades or telling people to be better. They are about changing the technical infrastructure of the incentive. If you make the process digital and transparent, you reduce the agent's ability to hide their actions. If you pay civil servants a high enough salary, you increase the cost of getting caught because they have more to lose. It is a math problem, not just a moral one.
We should probably look at the history of this, because it is not a new problem. Daniel was asking how far back this goes, and the answer is basically as far back as there has been organized human society. You can find ancient Egyptian records from the era of the New Kingdom where officials were being prosecuted for skimming grain off the top of the state storehouses. The moment you have a centralized authority collecting resources, you have someone trying to divert those resources.
The Romans were obsessed with it too. They actually had a specific court called the Quaestio de Repetundis, which was established in 149 before the Common Era, specifically to deal with provincial governors who were extorting the local populations. The irony, of course, is that the jurors on those courts were often other senators who were waiting for their own turn to go out and govern a province. It was the ultimate example of the fox guarding the chicken coop. The Roman system of tax farming, where private individuals bid for the right to collect taxes and kept anything they collected above the state's requirement, was basically legalized corruption by modern standards.
It is compelling how the definition of corruption has shifted over time. In the ancient world, and even into the early modern era, the idea of a public office as a private resource was almost the norm. In 17th century France, you literally bought your position as a judge or a tax collector from the king. It was called venality of office. You paid a lump sum up front, and then you made your money back by charging fees or taking a cut of the revenue. It was not seen as a violation of the system. It was the system. It provided the king with immediate cash and gave the elite a stake in the regime.
That is a vital distinction. The modern concept of the professional civil servant, someone who is impartial and paid a fixed salary to serve the state, is a relatively recent invention. In the United States, we had the spoils system throughout much of the 19th century. If your party won the election, you got to hand out all the government jobs, from postmasters to customs collectors to your supporters. It was not seen as corrupt in the way we think of it now, it was just how politics worked. It was called rotation in office.
Until it became so inefficient and scandalous that it started to threaten the stability of the country. The assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 was largely driven by a guy named Charles Guiteau, who was angry he did not get a government job through the spoils system. That was the catalyst for the Pendleton Act of 1883, which created the modern merit-based civil service. It was a technical solution to a systemic corruption problem. It shifted the incentive from who you know to what you know.
And that brings us to the comparative side of this. Why do some countries seem to solve this while others stay trapped in a cycle of graft? If you look at the top of the rankings every year, it is always the same names. Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, Norway. They consistently score in the high 80s or low 90s. What are they doing differently?
People often say it is just culture. They say the Danes are just naturally more honest, or they have a higher level of social trust. And while there might be some truth to the social trust aspect, I think it misses the structural reality. Denmark has one of the most digitally transparent procurement systems in the world. If the government buys a box of pencils or awards a contract for a new bridge, there is a digital trail that is accessible and searchable by the public. They have basically used technology to eliminate the dark corners where the principal agent problem thrives.
It is also about the size and scope of government. In many of those Nordic countries, while they have large welfare states, the actual regulatory burden on starting a business or getting a permit is often lower than in more corrupt countries. When you have fewer hurdles and fewer people with the power to say no, you have fewer opportunities for someone to demand a bribe to say yes. They have simplified the interface between the citizen and the state.
That is a classic conservative insight, right there. Corruption thrives in the gap between a complex regulation and its enforcement. If you have a 1,000-page tax code, you need an army of bureaucrats to interpret it, and every one of those bureaucrats has a tiny piece of power they can sell. If you simplify the code, you eliminate the market for that power. You are essentially deregulating the opportunity for graft.
You've hit the nail on the head. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Singapore exception. Singapore is fascinating because it is not a Nordic-style democracy, yet it consistently ranks as one of the least corrupt countries in the world. Their approach was very different. Lee Kuan Yew essentially looked at the problem and said, "We are going to treat the government like a high-end corporation. We are going to pay our cabinet ministers and top civil servants millions of dollars a year, matching or exceeding what they would make in the private sector."
It is the ultimate carrot and stick model. The carrot is that you are already rich, so a bribe of $50,000 is not worth the risk of losing your status. The stick is that if you are caught, the penalties are incredibly severe. They made the math of corruption simply not add up for the individual. But that model is hard to export. It is easy to do in a small city-state with a massive budget surplus. It is much harder to do in a massive, sprawling country where you have millions of civil servants. You cannot pay every mid-level manager in a huge federal bureaucracy $1 million a year.
And this brings us to the high-growth, high-corruption trap. You look at a country like China or India or even the United States during the Gilded Age. You see incredible economic growth happening alongside massive amounts of graft. There is a school of thought that suggests corruption can sometimes act as grease for the wheels in a highly inefficient system. If the laws are so broken that nothing can get done, a bribe might be the only way to build a factory or open a port.
That is a very controversial idea, but it is one that researchers have looked into. The problem is that while it might help in the very short term, it creates long-term institutional rot. Once you start paying for the grease, the bureaucrats have an incentive to make the wheels even squeakier so they can demand more grease. It creates a perverse incentive to make the system more complicated and less efficient. It is a tax on the future.
which leads us back to the Corruption Perceptions Index and how it interacts with democracy. We talked about this in episode 867 with the Democracy Dashboard. There is a very strong correlation between a country's corruption score and its democratic health. Corruption is often the leading indicator of democratic backsliding. Long before you see a coup or a stolen election, you see the erosion of independent audits, the silencing of whistleblowers, and the politicization of the civil service.
And that is why we have to be so careful about index gaming. If a country knows that its international reputation and its credit rating depend on its CPI score, they might focus on the optics rather than the reality. They might pass a transparency law that looks great on paper but has no enforcement mechanism. Or they might set up an anti-corruption commission that only targets the political opponents of the ruling party. We see this all the time in the 2025 data countries that are technically improving their legal framework while the actual experience of citizens on the ground is getting worse.
It is the Potemkin village of governance. You build the facade of an institution to satisfy the international observers, but behind the curtain, it is business as usual. This is why the World Bank's worldwide governance indicators are sometimes a better tool for deep analysis, because they break things down into 6 different dimensions like regulatory quality, rule of law, and voice and accountability, rather than just one single corruption score. It gives you a more 3-dimensional view of the problem.
I think we also need to talk about the role of the United States in this. We often think of corruption as a them problem, something that happens in the developing world. But the US has its own unique challenges. We have legalized a lot of things that other countries would consider corrupt. Our campaign finance system, the revolving door between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulate, the lobbying industry. These are all forms of institutional influence that can look a lot like corruption to an outside observer.
True, and from a conservative perspective, that is the most insidious form of corruption because it happens within the law. It is not a bribe paid in a brown paper bag. It is a legal contribution or a high-paying job offer after a person leaves office. It is the capture of the system. And the current indices are not always great at catching that because the people being surveyed, the experts and business leaders, often see these things as just how the business of government is done. They are part of the system being measured.
That is a crucial observation. If you ask an expert if there is illegal graft in Washington, they might say no, because everything is being done according to the rules. But if the rules themselves have been bought, the outcome is the same as if there were bags of cash changing hands. This is why some critics say the CPI has a Western bias. It is very good at catching the kind of corruption that involves breaking the law, but less effective at catching the kind of corruption that involves making the law.
So where does this go in the future? Can we move beyond perceptions? There is a lot of talk about using blockchain or distributed ledger technology for government procurement. The idea is that if every step of a contract from the bid to the final payment is recorded on an immutable public ledger, you don't need to survey experts to know if there was graft. You can just audit the code.
It is a beautiful technical vision, but it has a massive garbage in, garbage out problem. A blockchain can tell you that a payment was made to a certain address, but it cannot tell you if the work was actually done or if the price was inflated. If the government pays $10 million for a bridge that should have cost $5 million, and that payment is recorded perfectly on a blockchain, the theft has still happened. You still need human oversight. You still need a free press. And you still need a culture of accountability. Technology is a tool, not a savior.
It always comes back to the human element, doesn't it? Technology can shrink the dark corners, but it cannot eliminate the desire for power and profit. I think the takeaway for our listeners should be to look at these indices as a starting point, not the final word. When you see a country's score change, ask why. Is it because they actually changed their laws, or is it because they just got better at managing their image?
And pay attention to the de jure versus de facto implementation. De jure is what is on the books, the beautiful anti-corruption laws and the shiny new agencies. De facto is what actually happens on the street. A country can have the most beautiful laws in the world, but if the police are still taking $20 bills to look the other way, those laws are just ink on paper. Transparency is a technical infrastructure problem, but it requires a political will to actually use that infrastructure.
We are seeing a lot of this play out right now in the geopolitical arena. Look at how corruption is being used as a weapon in modern warfare. Part of the strategy in many recent conflicts has been to expose the graft of the opposing leadership to undermine their domestic support. Transparency is no longer just a good governance goal, it is a tactical asset. If you can prove the enemy leader is stealing from his own people, you can win the war without firing a shot.
It's a powerful shift in how we think about conflict. And if you are interested in how these international rules get set in the first place, you should definitely check out episode 1239. We did a deep dive into the invisible rules, looking at everything from how screw threads are standardized to how AI governance is being negotiated. It is the same kind of hidden infrastructure that defines how corruption is measured and managed globally.
Also, check out episode 1270 on the future of whistleblowing. It connects directly to this because as the world becomes more digital, the clandestine nature of corruption becomes harder to maintain. One person with a thumb drive can do more to expose a corrupt system than 1,000 international surveys. The evolution from the snitch to the system is a huge part of why some countries are finally starting to see their scores improve.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing: the danger of Goodhart's law. It is the idea that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. If we make the corruption perceptions index the only thing that matters, we are essentially telling governments that they only need to worry about being perceived as clean. We need to make sure we are measuring the things that actually lead to a better life for the citizens, like the quality of schools, the safety of roads, and the fairness of the courts.
That is the ultimate goal, right? It is not about the score, it is about the reality. It is about whether a person can start a business without paying off a local boss, or whether a student can get into a university based on their grades rather than their father's connections. Those are the things that build a strong nation. The index is just a proxy for that deeper trust.
Well said. I think we have covered a lot of ground today, from the principal agent problem to the Roman courts to the digital transparency of Denmark. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It really forced us to dig into the guts of how we quantify the unquantifiable.
Definitely. And to everyone listening, if you have found this discussion valuable, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Whether it is Spotify or Apple Podcasts, those ratings really do help other people find the show. We are a human, AI collaboration, and your feedback is part of what keeps this experiment going.
It really does make a difference, and if you want to find more episodes or use our archive search, head over to myweirdprompts.com. We have the full RSS feed there, and you can find links to all 1,300 plus episodes we have done. If you are a Telegram user, just search for My Weird Prompts to join our channel and get a notification every time a new episode drops.
We will be back next time with another exploration of the strange, the technical, and the deeply human. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for joining us. We will see you in the next one.
Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.